Hi, welcome to the Duty to Warn podcast. I'm your host, John Gartner, and today we're meeting with Dr. Michael Bader. For the last 35 years, he's been a psychologist and psychoanalyst. He's recently written More Than Bread and Butter. A psychologist speaks to progressives about what people really need to do to change the world. He's also the author of Fear of Winning. I have to say, when I saw that title, I was reminded that Donald Trump said that once he became president, we'd be doing so much winning that we would become tired of winning. And I thought, well, if this is what winning looks like, I think I'm developing a healthy fear of winning.
I think that's right. I think there is such a thing nowadays.
Right. So we have to rethink fear of winning. This could be a rational fear. But the reason that Dr. Bader is with us today is because he recently wrote an article, Psychoanalyzing Donald Trump. And I wanted to talk to you more about that. You say in the article that you agree that psychologists have a duty to warn people. This is the subtitle of the article. Psychologists have a duty to warn people about the danger of Trump. And I wanted you to say more about that, more about your feeling about why psychologists have a duty to warn, and if we have a duty to warn, and specifically what it is we need to warn them about with Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated issue, the issue of psychologists speaking out about the mental state of public figures. In general, I've been quite skeptical about attempts to sort of weigh in on Anthony Weiner, Tiger Woods, a whole host of public figures who've gotten themselves into trouble psychologically, and then everyone becomes sort of an expert on who they are and what makes them tick, and based on very little information.
Right.
I think the difference is with Trump is that we're not just subject to him in a way that we're not to Anthony Weiner or Tiger Woods, but the more we understand about what the psychological dynamics are behind his behavior, the more able we are to predict certain things potentially and understand them and not be as bewildered as I think so many of us have been since he took over. It's like a tsunami of behavior that's been impulsive and chaotic and shoot from the hip, kind of striking out aggressive moves here and there and bombastic pronouncements, and it just sort of hits us like a hailstorm. And I think that we have to ground ourselves and see, well, no, there are a few basic principles in psychology that help us understand someone like Trump, even though we're not saying with any degree of certainty that this is exactly what motivates this particular man. And also, I'll say that our interest is not in diagnosing Trump. Our interest is in trying to understand Trump and understand his vulnerabilities, his desires, his fears, maybe some of his defenses, in order to be able to put in some kind of reasonable context behavior that otherwise is quite bewildering, and I think is bewildering to many, many people.
Well, why don't we get to that? You talk about the dynamics of the you call the Toxic Triad. Maybe you want to say more about that you think underlie, you do use the term malignant narcissism, just to say, since I have diagnosed him with that. And you note that he does show the constellation of narcissism with the sociopathic features and the paranoid features. But I think what you're more interested in is the dynamics behind that, the conflict that's being expressed. And so that's where it gets to your Toxic Triad.
Right. So I think we have to distinguish between a descriptive psychiatric point of view and a dynamic understanding. A descriptive psychiatric point of view can be very useful and a handy way to categorize somebody by their list of symptoms and whether or not it conforms to DSM criteria for a particular diagnosis. That, to me, while it's sort of interesting from a distance, it doesn't feel very useful to me. Unless one goes a step further and tries to understand, well, how do we understand these symptoms that we've
dynamics
successfully listed and described? So that's where I go into what I think is a useful paradigm, which is a dynamic approach, which says something simple like this, that people and the mind is wired in all of us to avoid or defend ourselves against experiencing distressing feelings and beliefs. We're all wired that way. And so from the simplest thing, that somebody might be afraid of feeling too dependent. And so you might see this person affect an attitude of hyper independence and autonomy. I don't need anybody. And it wouldn't be far-fetched for most people to think, well, maybe he has a fear or she has a fear of seeming weak and dependent. So they have to accentuate the opposite. That's sort of an everyday, commonplace example of how our minds are wired to avoid or escape, get away from painful affects and beliefs. So what that means is, if we think of that model, it means that when somebody shows a behavior that seems extreme or sort of stands out in some relief, for instance, Trump's insistent claim that he's great and that everything he does is great and big and better than anybody else, then using this model, we can often infer what that trait must be an attempt to escape from.
Right. And so it suggests its opposite.
Right, it suggests its opposite. And, that's sort of a simplistic way of putting something that actually is quite profound and useful and powerful in everyday clinical practice, and we use it all the time. So when someone's grandiose, like Trump appears to be, then we think, well, they're likely defending themselves against feelings of helplessness and inferiority, of feeling small, so that they have to act big and they have to proclaim that everything they do is great. So in looking at a range of his behaviors that are really part of the public, sort of the public sphere, that sort of everyone sort of agrees on are sort of extreme behaviors in Trump, my view is that you could infer that they're likely defenses against feelings of helplessness, inferiority, and shame. So, for instance, he surrounds himself with people who are flatterers, sycophants. He always is with beautiful women. He adorns his where he lives and where he works with beautiful gold lame fixtures, curtains, all of this, as if by creating a beautiful, spectacular, rich external environment, he could silence and avoid having to feel inside that he may be in any way damaged or inferior or ashamed of himself, of anything. So that's one example. Obviously, the grandiosity is another. And then, I was rereading the New Yorker article in which the author interviews Tony Schwartz, who co-wrote Trump's book, The Art of the Deal. And he's talking about something that many people have noticed, which is Trump's inability to pay attention, that he can't sit and pay attention. So I was thinking, well, if you put yourself in the position of someone, what does it take to pay attention to somebody speaking to you? It doesn't just take the ability to empathize, but it requires that you be able to surrender some of the space around you to allow the other person to fill it. You'll be a listener and a learner. Yeah. But for Trump, he can't do it because the position of being a listener is too close to feeling controlled, one down, and as if he doesn't know something. And the experience, I don't know something that I'm learning about from someone else, puts him in the position of feeling that there's something missing in him, and he can't stand it. So you see, and it's reported frequently, this sort of compulsive, peripatetic, ADD-like behavior in which he interrupts, or he steers the conversation around to something that reflects well on him, or he gets up and physically leaves. And Schwartz says he can't pay attention for more than 2 minutes without getting visibly anxious.
That's so interesting to think about that as actually a dynamically driven thing rather than, as you say, just an ADD or I hadn't ever really considered that.
As a trait. We think of it as a trait. We think in terms of traits. And And what I think about is I try to think about meaning and about why is it so hard? Why is somebody compelled to interrupt and push back and get up and leave and can't stay put? It's not just a descriptive situation. It's actually something that must be motivated. And I think that's what we need to do when we look at public figures that are exhibiting behavior that could be dangerous if deployed in certain arenas.
So how could this be dangerous?
Well, for instance, if someone in a position like Trump's were to feel upstaged or humiliated by another leader, let's say someone either domestically or someone internationally, one might infer that this would be intolerable.
Yes.
And that someone's response, we call this narcissistic rage. When someone's sense of their own importance is deflated or punctured or challenged, the person responds with rage, which is an attempt to control a state in which they're made to feel weak and helpless and bad. So that could not just generate political, diplomatic indiscretions, but potentially, if it were extreme enough, it could provoke somebody to respond militarily to a perceived slight that a leader experiences as quite personal, even though it really is public and political. And for someone who's narcissistically vulnerable, which is how we would describe someone like Trump, they can't separate the personal from the public. So if they lose a contest, they are threatened with feeling like a loser.
Yes.
And if they are found to have benefited, let's say in the last election, from Russian interference, they're likely to feel as if their sense of accomplishment has been destroyed and deflated. And then they respond with kind of rageful countermeasures, which is what I think we're seeing with him.
So this is where the danger is. He's so easily narcissistically injured, and he lashes out so violently, and he has so much power. So we put those three things together, and he could do a little Marco, what he did with Marco Rubio, but do it to Kim Jong-un. And provoke an actual nuclear war.
Now you think about what his life was like before he became president. He had a lot of power then, too, in his empire. But he could control his environment 100%. He could sanitize it of any challenge or any threat or any potential exposure or embarrassment. He could surround himself with yes men. He could adorn his physical environment with perfection and beauty and immunize himself against those situations that are likely to trigger these very painful affects of inferiority, helplessness, and shame.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize that when we call Trump narcissistic, when we say he has a narcissistic personality disorder, what we really mean are that these narcissistic symptoms are attempts to solve a problem, and that what we see in all psychiatric diagnoses is that the attempts to solve a problem create problems. So when he's sitting alone in the White House at 4 a.m. and he's watching the news that is threatening to expose him or shame him, and he rages against the mainstream media and starts to tweet, his tweets can create problems for him and others. But his tweets are not the core of the issue. His tweets are attempts to solve a problem and strike back and suppress a feeling, but the solution becomes a problem. And that's what is our everyday work as psychotherapists, is seeing how people's attempt to achieve short-term safety and security creates long-term problems.
Lawrence O'Donnell was talking about how it must be killing Trump not to be able to tweet during the Comey hearings. Like someone was obviously sitting on him.
Yeah, it must be. And then he explodes at 3 or 4 in the morning.
Yeah.
His defenses are lower. He allows himself to start to feel the sense of threat and vulnerability, helplessness, shame, and there's no one around to restrain him. So that's when he starts to fire off. Fire up, fire off.
And what's so amazing, too, is the sheer quantity of his tweets, like 34,000, and how many of them...
Is that how many there's been?
34,000. Think about that. And how many of them are just filled with invective and rage at so many people. I actually did an introduction to a book about his tweets, and so I had to read hundreds and hundreds of them. And it was just... Wow. Actually, it reminded me of some of your concepts, because haters and losers is one of his favorite categories. And so the people who are both inferior and bad.
Yes, that's a really good point. You see, he uses the word loser a lot, and so if we're in a clinical situation and someone is fixated on other people being losers, we just don't even think twice about assuming that they are afraid of feeling like losers themselves. So when they win something like a presidential election and then the results are called into question, it is the quintessential threat and injury to somebody who is himself afraid of being a loser.
Now, his reaction to that was to claim that he did win the popular vote, that to make up a wild conspiracy story about 3 million immigrants being shipped from Massachusetts to New Hampshire. That would be like the D-Day invasion. But nobody took a snapshot of it on their cell phone. And that he had the biggest inauguration size in history. So what do you make of how he can shape ideas to counter these intolerable feelings?
It's easy. We're not surprised by that at all, because we say that somebody interprets reality in ways that preserve their sense of themselves as good, decent people. Good, decent, lovable, respectable people. So when there's a challenge or a threat to our self-esteem, and it's sharp enough and painful enough, then we will do anything, including deny reality, distort reality. Look, even people we treat who are psychotic, we will take something like somebody has a delusional idea that somebody I treated many years ago, that there were satellites that were controlling his mind. Okay? Now, that's a psychotic idea. We treat it with medication, but I was also doing psychotherapy with the person, and I came to understand that a delusional explanation is better than no explanation for feelings of intense panic. This person had a feeling that the world was falling apart. He was losing his sense of himself. And the way he organized reality was to distort it and create a delusional notion of the universe in which his mind was being controlled, because he was so afraid of losing his mind. And so even with crazy ideas, they're attempts to solve a problem that comes before it. And unless we can see it that way, then we're just enamored of the symptom, and we don't ever ask the question of what is the problem that the symptom is intended to solve.
So given that he is able to distort reality to this, what would almost seem to be delusional degree, but we're not going to get descriptively psychiatric, but what does that say about anything we need to warn the public about? What could go wrong there?
Well, I mean, what goes wrong has to do with his playing with reality all the time. So, you don't know whether or not his public statements that are constructions of reality have any relationship to actual reality at all, unless they're vetted by third parties. And so what you have is an extremely animated, aggressive sort of phalanx of mainstream media that take every comment that he makes and subjects it to objective analysis. So that means that everything that he claims has to be screened through a second level of vetting that normally you wouldn't have to do with a leader.
Well, I really want to thank you for taking this time to talk to us, and I think that you've given us some very deep thoughts to think about, and so I think that's something we'll keep in mind. Every time Trump does something really crazy or aggressive or destructive, just try to think about the feelings he's trying to avoid.
Yeah, you say that, how is this crazy act an attempt to solve a problem? And it puts you in a kind of affirmative, like we think that symptoms have an affirmative purpose. And we're not used to thinking that way, but it puts you in the position of that we can sort of empathize with it, because people don't do crazy things for no reason. They usually do crazy things for reasons that if you understand them well enough, you can see the interior logic to them. And that's what I think we have to do, even if with someone that we may despise or we may oppose politically. But I have a question for you.
What's that?
The question is, how have you dealt with the critique of the duty to warn movement based on the Goldwater rule objection? In other words, how do you think about it? About the Goldwater rule, how it was originally adopted, and how it's supposed to play out in our discussions today?
I'll give you the short answer and the long answer.
Okay, good.
The short answer is, if there was a bomb on an airplane, what ethical prohibition would stop you from warning the passengers?
None.
That's the answer.
Mm-hmm. So what's the longer answer?
Well, the longer answer is that this is very different than the Goldwater case. I mean, let's remember, this is not a core ethical principle. This is something that was developed in response to a lawsuit where a few psychiatrists were a little irresponsible in making some statements that were inaccurate. It was also in the Freudian era where, not in any way to denigrate psychodynamic thinking, but where they were inferring internal psychic processes rather than commenting on things that are descriptive that they could actually observe themselves. And that was the change of the DSM, which is limited, as you say. But its one advantage, maybe its only advantage, is that it does make diagnosis very clearly its intent, according to Bob Spitzer.
Yeah.
His only intent was to have objective, observable criteria that essentially any inter-rater reliability could be very high, and that everyone could observe and see what the patient did, what they said. So the Goldwater thing was before we even had DSM. Now it's clearly very easy to make a diagnosis in what is, as you say, a simplistic system, simply a description of observable behaviors. Does Donald Trump lie? Yes, check the box. We move on. So it doesn't even make sense intellectually. And it doesn't make sense morally that you would warn the people on the plane and you'd worry about the technicalities later.
Yes.
In Judaism, we have the same principle. There are 613 laws. You can break all of them, all 613, to save a life.
Yep.
Because life is more sacred. That's why we have the Tarasov decision. The Tarasov decision is not just a narrow decision about a certain procedure. It also expresses a principle that we would even violate our most sacred principle, which is confidentiality, in order to save a life. So if we can violate that, we can certainly violate some post-lawsuit codicil that isn't even actually objectively applicable anymore. And to be honest, talk about dynamics, I look at the motivation of the APA and why they're so adamant about Goldwater. And it's clearly, they've said it very clearly, they want to protect the profession. So this is their attempt to protect themselves from controversy or lawsuits or getting anyone mad at them, and anything that would interfere with their alliance with Big Pharma and their ability to earn money.
That's interesting.
Or make
I like the way you think about this. Has there been any official disapproval or communication to you from any of the APAs about your conferences or about weighing in on Trump's psyche?
No, not yet. I don't think they've really been aggressive because they're under so much fire from within. I mean, at the latest APA meeting, there was a lot of controversy. And this was a very big issue. Claire Pouncey, who I'm going to be speaking to, is a psychiatrist who's written about this in the psychiatric literature. And she argues that the Goldwater Rule is actually immoral and also violates the free speech rights of psychiatrists, but also deprives them of a chance to benefit the public with their understanding.
That's great. I love that. That's just great.
And actually, we had someone from the APA defend the Goldwater Rule at our conference, our Duty to Warn conference at Yale, and he explicitly said, we do not have a responsibility to the public. He actually said those words.
Wow.
We have a responsibility to our patient and to our code of ethics and blah, blah, blah. It's like, so they're saying explicitly that they don't feel a responsibility for the public welfare. So I think in our ethical code, we do have a responsibility actually to educate the public, but also at a deeper level to be concerned about their welfare.
They're cowards. The organizations are cowards. They're has anyone been brought up in front of their licensing board because of? I've
heard a rumor of one case in Missouri. But I don't know if that's true. Even there, I think people are not. The fear of it is much greater than the reality of it.
Well, I'll tell you something. I have to say that I've, I write a lot for Alternet. I wrote for Huffington Post. I wrote on my Psychology Today blog, and particularly on the Psychology Today blog, where it's not a leftist audience that reads me. It's more of a range. People under the guise of anonymity on these blogs can get really crazy, threatening, salt of, and so some blog picked up my Alternet piece, and this guy went after me on this blog, and the guy who posted it on the blog said, look, this guy's a little crazy, blah, 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 but he just went crazy on my ass about the Goldwater Rule and what does it mean and how can you say you're going to psychoanalyze him when explicitly that's what was forbidden, and here's the way the wording is and all this stuff, and he just boom.
I get hundreds of those. Hundreds.
I never.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I said. Even though I never really read comments to my articles, I never read the comments. This one I, for some reason, got hooked on. And I'm reading this, and in the back of my mind, I start to get nervous. And I think, don't get nervous. That's crazy. This is one lunatic on one blog. But in my state, in California, the Psychology Licensing Board investigates every letter that goes to them about a practitioner in their state.
Right.
And
we're easily intimidated, and people are intimidated. And I believe me, I hear it over and over and over again. And probably the fear is much worse than the reality, but nonetheless, people are intimidated. Well, I've likened the American Psychiatric Association, and a couple of my guests did spontaneously, to the German Psychiatric Association of the 1930s.
That's right. Robert J. Lifton, man. That's right.
So anyway, all right, well, I'm going to have to go, but this has been a fascinating conversation. It's been great to meet you.
Really nice to meet you, and I'll let you know about the conference in October. I'm definitely going to come, and whether there's a.
Oh wait, you were potentially going to speak at which one?
I think the one I asked about, the one in DC.
DC, right? Because you're in California, but you asked about DC. Yes, actually, we really need speakers in DC.
Okay.
So all come. Right. Will you come?
I think I'm definitely going to come, and I'm just thinking about, Okay.
So we have tapes, unlike Trump. We have tapes. So I have you on tape saying you're coming. So it's going to go on YouTube. So I didn't turn the recorder off. So you're coming, buddy.
Shit. Okay. All right.
Well, and I'm going to be at the DC meeting too. So I'll meet you in person then.
Good. It's a pleasure.
All right.
And
Nice.
you're doing great work. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.